The Grand Assembly Hall stretched across 3 kilometers of orbital space. A massive structure built by 17 species working together over 200 years. And it had never been so quiet as it was on this day. Ambassador HFY of the Villani Collective stood at the central speaking platform, her crystalline body flickering with colors that showed her deep fear. And every single one of the 800 delegates from across the galaxy watched her in complete silence. The Void Heralds have crossed into our space, she announced, her voice carrying through translation systems to every corner of the massive chamber. 3 frontier civilizations have already fallen, and we have received no survivors, no refugees, and no communication from any of them. The silence broke into chaos as hundreds of alien voices rose in panic and confusion and disbelief. Because the Galactic Concord had existed for 11,000 years without facing a threat like this. And most species had forgotten what true war even looked like. High Chancellor Morvith of the Corvette Dominion slammed his massive fist against his speaking console to demand order. And slowly the assembly fell quiet again. "How long do we have?" he asked in his deep rumbling voice. HFY checked her data crystal before answering. "Our calculation engines predict 18 cycles before they reach the core systems. Assuming they continue at their current speed." 18 cycles, the delegates murmured among themselves, which translated to roughly 5 standard years in human measurement. And that seemed like both an eternity and no time at all. "We must mobilize our defense fleets," announced Admiral Yelthra of the Mercian Sovereignty, her feline features twisted with determination. "My pilots stand ready to defend the Concord. With respect," HFY replied carefully. "Our fleets have not engaged in true combat for over 3,000 years, and our weapons are designed for peacekeeping and border disputes, not extinction-level warfare." The truth of her words hung heavy in the air because everyone knew she was right. And the Concord's military might was more symbol than substance after millennia of peace. Then a voice spoke from the far corner of the assembly, where the newer and less important species were seated. "What about the humans?" Every head turned toward the speaker, a young Villani delegate who immediately seemed to regret drawing attention to herself. "The humans?" High Chancellor Morvith repeated with obvious distaste. "Those primitive warmongers who barely achieved interstellar travel 2 centuries ago. They are members of the Concord." The young delegate pressed on despite her nervousness. "And they have maintained active military forces throughout their membership, which is something none of our species have done." Murmurs spread through the assembly as delegates considered this suggestion, and many of them showed expressions of reluctance or outright disgust at the idea of asking humans for help. Ambassador HFY remembered her single visit to Earth many years ago and how uncomfortable the experience had made her feel, because humans moved too fast and spoke too loud and seemed to vibrate with an energy that other species found exhausting. But she also remembered the strange saying a human diplomat had shared with her during that visit, words that had haunted her ever since. "Peace is just the time between wars." She had thought it was a crude joke at the time, a sign of human immaturity. But now those words echoed in her mind with new and terrible meaning. "I will go," HFY announced before she could talk herself out of it. "I will travel to the human homeworld and request their assistance." The journey to Earth took 3 standard days through the Fold Space Network, and HFY spent most of that time reviewing everything the Concord knew about humanity. They were a young species by galactic standards, having discovered fire only 100,000 years ago and achieving space travel just 3 centuries past. And their history was a bloody catalog of wars and conflicts and violence that made other species uncomfortable to read. The Concord had granted them provisional membership partly out of curiosity and partly out of a desire to civilize them. to help them grow past their aggressive phase, as all species eventually did. But humans had never quite fit the pattern that the Concorde expected, and they had maintained their military traditions even as they participated in peaceful galactic society, which the other species viewed as either quaint or concerning. Depending on their perspective, HFY arrived at the human orbital station called Armstrong and was immediately struck by how different it felt from Concorde facilities, because everything here was functional rather than beautiful, designed for efficiency rather than aesthetics. A human officer met her at the docking bay, a young man with skin the color of dark wood and a smile that seemed genuine despite the circumstances. Ambassador HFY. He greeted her with a slight bow. Admiral Chun is expecting you, and if you will follow me. They walked through corridors that buzzed with activity, past humans in uniform who moved with purpose and spoke in quick, sharp sentences. And HFY noticed that many of them carried weapons openly on their hips. The Admiral's office was located at the heart of the station, and HFY found herself facing a human female of middle age with gray streaking her black hair and scars visible on her face and hands. Ambassador, Admiral Chen Wei-Lin said without any of the flowery greetings that were customary in Concorde diplomacy. I assume you are here about the Void Heralds. HFY felt her crystalline form flicker with surprise at the Admiral's words. You know about them, she asked. We have been monitoring their advance for 30 years, the Admiral replied calmly as she gestured for HFY to sit. 30 years. HFY could not hide her shock, but the Concorde only detected them 8 cycles ago. Admiral Chun nodded and pulled up holographic display that showed a star map with red markers spreading across one section of the galaxy. 70 years ago, we built listening posts in the dark space between galaxies, she explained. We detected the Herald fleet long before they entered Concorde sensor range. HFY struggled to process this information as questions tumbled through her mind. Why did you not warn us? She finally managed to ask. The Admiral's expression remained unreadable as she answered. Would you have believed us? The question hit HFY like a physical blow because she knew the answer immediately, and the answer was no. Because the Concorde would never have taken a warning from primitive humans seriously. We tried, Admiral Chung continued. 15 years ago, we submitted a report to the Concorde Security Council about potential threats from dark space, and it was dismissed as human paranoia and warmongering. HFY remembered that report, now with a feeling of deep shame, because she herself had voted to dismiss it. So you prepared alone, she said quietly. We always prepare alone, the Admiral replied. And there was no bitterness in her voice, only a weary acceptance. That is what it means to be human in a galaxy that thinks peace is permanent. She stood and walked to the viewport that showed the stars stretching into infinity. But we are not alone now, Ambassador. And if the Concorde is finally ready to listen, then humanity is ready to help. HFY rose from her seat and joined the Admiral at the viewport, looking out at those distant stars and wondering how many of them would go dark before this war was over. Tell me what you need, she said. Admiral Chun smiled. And it was not a warm smile, but rather the smile of someone who had been waiting a very long time for this moment. First, she said, let me show you what humanity has been building while the galaxy slept. The shuttle descended through the thin atmosphere of Earth's moon and HFY watched through the viewport as the gray landscape stretched endlessly below them. Cratered and barren and seemingly lifeless. There is nothing here, she said to Admiral Chun, who sat beside her in the passenger compartment. The Admiral's expression did not change as she replied. That is what we want everyone to think. The shuttle angled toward a particular crater that looked no different from any other. But as they approached, HFY noticed a shimmer in the air that suggested some kind of energy field was present. They passed through the shimmer and suddenly the crater floor opened beneath them, revealing a massive shaft that plunged deep into the lunar surface. And Cathay felt her crystalline form flicker with astonishment. The shuttle continued downward for several minutes, passing level after level of construction that should not have existed, until finally they emerged into a cavern so vast that Cathay could not see its far walls. "Welcome to Bunker 7, Admiral Chun said as the shuttle landed on a platform overlooking the facility. "This is one of 12 primary installations hidden throughout the Sol system." Cathay stepped out of the shuttle and struggled to comprehend what she was seeing, because the cavern contained an entire military infrastructure that rivaled anything the Concorde possessed. Ships hung in construction cradles by the hundreds, their designs unlike anything in the galactic registry, sleek and predatory with weapon systems that Cathay could not identify even with her advanced education. Thousands of humans moved through the facility in organized patterns, some working on the ships while others trained in combat exercises, and the sound of their activity created a constant hum of purposeful energy. "How long has this been here?" Cathay asked in a voice barely above a whisper. "Construction began 180 years ago," the Admiral replied. 6 months after we achieved faster than light travel and discovered the galaxy was at peace." A human male approached them, tall and broad with skin like polished obsidian and a uniform covered in medals and insignia that Cathay did not recognize. "Ambassador," Admiral Chun said, "allow me to introduce General Marcus Okonkwo, commander of Bunker 7 and one of the architects of our defensive strategy." The general extended his hand in the human greeting gesture, and Cathay touched her crystalline appendage to his palm. "It is an honor to meet a representative of the Concorde," General Okonkwo said. "Even under these circumstances, I do not understand," Cathay said as they began walking through the facility. "When humanity joined the Concorde, we were told that war was obsolete, that civilizations grow past violence as they mature. Yet you built all of this anyway." The general nodded slowly as they passed a training area where human soldiers practiced hand-to-hand combat with a ferocity that made Cathay uncomfortable. "We have heard those words before," he said. "Throughout our history, there have always been voices telling us that war was finished, that peace would last forever, that we could finally beat our swords into plowshares." He stopped and turned to face her directly, and every single time those voices were wrong. "Ambassador, because every period of peace in human history has eventually ended, often in ways that no one predicted. And the civilizations that survived were the ones who remembered how to fight." They continued walking past weapons storage facilities that contained armaments Cathay had never seen before, past medical bays designed to handle mass casualties, past simulation chambers where officers trained for scenarios involving enemies they had never met. "We call it the doctrine of paranoia," General Okonkwo explained. "Every generation of humanity hopes they will be the ones who never need these weapons, the ones who can finally trust that peace is permanent." He gestured at the bustling facility around them. "And every generation builds them anyway, because hope is not a strategy, and the price of being wrong is extinction." Cathay thought about the Concorde's approach to security. The token fleets maintained for ceremony and peacekeeping. The assumption that 11,000 years of stability meant 11,000 more. "The galaxy thought you were primitive," she said quietly. "We thought your focus on military matters was a sign of immaturity, a phase you would eventually outgrow." Admiral Chun spoke from beside her. "We know what the galaxy thinks of us, Ambassador, and we have never tried to change those perceptions." "Why not?" The Admiral's smile was thin and sharp. "Because underestimation is a weapon too." They entered a command center filled with holographic displays showing real-time data from across the galaxy. And Cathay realized that humanity's intelligence network was far more extensive than anyone had suspected. "You have been watching everything," she said as she studied the displays. Every species, every system, every potential threat. For 2 centuries, General Okonkwo confirmed. We learned early that the galaxy did not take us seriously, so we decided to use that to our advantage. To watch and learn and prepare, while everyone else assumed we were too primitive to matter. He pulled up a display showing the Void Herald fleet. Far more detailed than anything the Concorde possessed. We have analyzed their technology, their tactics, their patterns of conquest, he said. They are not mindless destroyers, Ambassador. They are harvesters. And what they harvest is fear. Catherine studied the data with growing horror as she realized what the general was describing. They feed on the neural energy released during death, she said. Especially death accompanied by terror, which is why they conquer slowly, Admiral Chun added. They could move faster, but they prefer to let fear spread ahead of them. To let civilizations panic and despair before they arrive. Because that makes the harvest richer. Then how do you plan to fight them? Catherine asked. If they grow stronger from the fear of their enemies. General Okonkwo's expression shifted into something that Catherine could only describe as hungry. That is precisely why humanity may be the only species capable of defeating them, he said. Because we have spent our entire existence learning how to fight while terrified. How to function when every instinct screams at us to run. How to turn fear into fuel rather than paralysis. He pulled up another display showing human soldiers in combat situations throughout history. Facing enemies that should have destroyed them. Fighting in conditions that should have broken them. Fear does not stop humans, he said. It makes us dangerous. Admiral Chun stepped forward and placed her hand on Catherine's shoulder in a gesture that felt strangely comforting. We are not asking the Concorde to let us fight alone, she said. We are asking for the chance to teach the galaxy what humanity has learned through thousands of years of bloody experience. Catherine looked around at the facility, at the ships and weapons and soldiers that represented 2 centuries of secret preparation. And she felt something she had not expected to feel: hope. The Concorde Assembly will need to approve any alliance, she said. And there are many who still view humanity with suspicion. Then convince them, General Okonkwo said simply. Because the Void Heralds will not wait for the galaxy to overcome its prejudices, and when they arrive, only those who prepare will survive. Catherine nodded slowly and made her decision. I will return to the assembly, she said, and I will tell them the truth about humanity, about what you have built here, about what you offer. Admiral Chun smiled, and this time there was warmth in it. That is all we ask, Ambassador. The chance to prove that being prepared for war is not the same as wanting it. As the shuttle carried her back toward the stars, Catherine found herself thinking about the human phrase she had once dismissed as barbaric. Peace is just the time between wars. Perhaps the humans had been right all along. And perhaps the galaxy needed to learn that lesson before it was too late. The vote in the Grand Assembly was closer than anyone expected, with 412 species voting in favor of the Human Alliance and 435 voting against. But in the end, the abstentions from the Yend frontier worlds tipped the balance because they knew better than anyone what was coming 2 weeks. Later, the first Concorde delegates arrived at the human military station in orbit around Mars. And what they found there changed everything they thought they knew about warfare. Commander Yothra of the Mercian Sovereignty stood in the observation deck overlooking the main training facility, her feline eyes wide with disbelief as she watched human soldiers running combat drills in conditions that would have killed most species. They are training in 3 times standard gravity, she said to her human escort, a young officer named Lieutenant Colonel Sarambeki. While wearing full combat armor and carrying heavy weapons. Standard conditioning, Mackie replied with a casual shrug. We increase the difficulty by 10% every week until they reach their limits. Then we push past those limits. Yelthra watched as a squad of humans completed an obstacle course that involved climbing, swimming, fighting, and problem-solving, all while instructors shouted at them and threw simulated grenades at their feet. "And this is how all human soldiers train?" she asked. "This is basic training," Meki said. "The Special Forces programs are considerably more intense." Below them, a human soldier stumbled and fell, and Yelthra expected the instructors to help him up, but instead, they increased the pressure, forcing him to rise on his own and continue the course. "Why do you push them so hard?" Yelthra asked. "Surely, there must be limits to what the body can endure." Becky turned to face her with an expression that was neither cruel nor kind. Simply matter of fact, the Void Heralds will not give our soldiers a break when they are tired, she said. They will not pause the battle because someone is struggling. So we train our people to function when every part of them wants to quit, because that is when battles are won or lost. Over the following weeks, Yelthra learned more about human military doctrine than she had ever wanted to know. And she began to understand why the galaxy had underestimated this species. For so long, humans did not just train their bodies. They trained their minds, studying tactics and strategy and psychology and xenobiology, learning how to fight enemies they had never seen by understanding the principles that governed all conflict. A soldier who only knows how to shoot is a weapon, Maki explained during one of their many conversations. A soldier who understands why they fight and how the enemy thinks is a force multiplier, capable of adapting to situations that no one predicted. Meanwhile, the combined fleet gathered in the Terran system, bringing together ships from over 300 species and the largest military force ever assembled in galactic history. Admiral Chun established a joint command structure that placed human tactical officers alongside commanders from every major Concord species, and the process was not smooth, because centuries of assumptions had to be overcome. High Chancellor Morvith of the Corvith Dominion initially refused to take orders from any human, declaring that his species had ruled empires while humanity was still living in caves. With respect, Chancellor, Admiral Chun replied during a particularly tense meeting, "Your empires fell because you assumed your enemies would fight the way you expected. And that is exactly the mistake the Void Heralds are counting on us to make." She pulled up tactical displays showing the Herald conquest patterns. They adapt to every opponent they face, she explained. They learn from each battle and modify their tactics accordingly, which means any rigid command structure will fail against them. "What do you propose?" Morvith demanded. "Flexible response doctrine," Chun said. "We train every unit to operate independently when necessary, to make decisions based on the situation rather than waiting for orders from above, to think like predators rather than prey." The concept was alien to most Concord species who preferred rigid hierarchies and clear chains of command. But they had no better alternatives, so they agreed to try the human approach. Lieutenant Colonel Becky was assigned to work with immersion pilots, a task she approached with her typical directness. "Your pilots are the best natural flyers in the galaxy," she told Commander Yelthra. "Your reflexes are faster than anything we can match, and your spatial awareness is beyond anything humans possess." Yelthra felt pride swelling in her chest at the praise. "But you have never fought an enemy who wants to kill you," Becky continued. "Your combat experience is limited to ceremonial duels and border skirmishes where both sides follow rules. And the Void Heralds do not follow rules." The Mercian commander felt her pride deflate somewhat. "Then teach us," she said. "Teach us how to fight like humans." What followed was the most intense training Yelthra had ever experienced, pushing her pilots through simulations that grew progressively more brutal. Scenarios where the enemy cheated, where allies turned traitor, where victory required sacrifice. Many of her pilots broke under the pressure and had to be reassigned. But those who remained emerged stronger than before, their natural abilities now combined with a human Understanding of total war. Similar transformations occurred throughout the fleet as human trainers worked with every species, adapting their methods to each culture while instilling the core principles that had kept humanity alive through millennia of conflict. Never assume the battle is won until the enemy is destroyed. Plan for everything to go wrong. Fear is natural, but surrender is a choice. Your enemy is not a monster. They are a problem to be solved. The Vellani learned to use their calculation engines for battlefield prediction rather than economic modeling, and their projections became terrifyingly accurate. The Corvus Dominion discovered that their massive numbers could be an advantage rather than a liability, if properly coordinated, and their shock troops began training in boarding, tactics that human marines had perfected centuries ago. Even the pacifist species found ways to contribute, providing medical support and logistics and intelligence. Analysis that freed combat-capable forces for the front lines. 4 months after the alliance was formed, Admiral Chun called a General Assembly to review their progress. "We have achieved something unprecedented," she announced to the gathered commanders. "A truly unified fighting force composed of species who barely trusted each other a year ago." She paused and let her gaze sweep across the assembled faces. "But I will not lie to you, because the Void Heralds have destroyed civilizations far older and more powerful than our alliance, and they will not be easily defeated." Commander Yelfra found herself speaking before she could stop herself. "Then, why do you believe we can win?" Admiral Chun smiled, and there was something fierce and proud in her expression. "Because they have never faced an enemy like this," she said. "They have conquered species who fought alone, who relied on single advantages, who broke when their plans failed." She activated a holographic display showing the combined fleet in all its diversity. "We are different, Commander. We are not one species with one strategy. We are hundreds of species combining thousands of years of knowledge and experience. And when one approach fails, we will have dozens more ready to deploy." She turned back to face the assembly. "The Void Heralds expect prey. They expect fear. They expect surrender. And we are going to show them what happens when prey fights back with everything it has." A cheer rose from the assembled commanders, a sound that combined hundreds of different voices and languages and cultures into a single expression of defiance. In her seat near the front, Cathay felt tears forming in her crystalline eyes, because she finally understood what made humanity dangerous. It was not their weapons or their tactics or their willingness to fight. It was their ability to inspire others to fight alongside them as the fleet prepared for the coming battle. She found herself believing, perhaps for the first time, that they might actually have a chance. The Keth Nebula burned with the light of dying stars, a swirling mass of gas and radiation that marked the boundary between Concord space and the territory the Void Heralds had already consumed. And it was here that the combined fleet made its stand. Admiral Chun stood on the bridge of her flagship, the Thermopylae, named for an ancient human battle where a small force had held against impossible odds. And she watched the tactical display as the Herald fleet emerged from fold space. There were thousands of them, massive vessels that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, their hulls covered in strange organic patterns that pulsed with an inner darkness. And they moved in perfect coordination like a single vast predator. "All ships report ready," her tactical officer announced. "The Mercian squadrons are in position. The Corvus assault carriers are standing by. And the Vellani prediction matrix is online." Chun nodded and opened a channel to the entire fleet. "This is Admiral Chun to all vessels," she said, her voice calm and steady despite the fear that churned in her stomach. "The enemy believes they are here to harvest another civilization, to add our terror to their collection, to feed on our despair." She paused and let her words sink in. "They are wrong. Because today we are not prey. We are not victims. We are the galaxy standing together for the first time in history. And we are going to teach these monsters what it means to fight something that refuses to be afraid. Across the fleet, warriors of 100 species felt something stir in their hearts. A resolve that pushed back against the instinctive dread that the Herald presence inspired. Commander Yelthra sat in the cockpit of her fighter, surrounded by her squadron of Mercian pilots who had trained harder than any generation before them. And she felt ready in a way she had never felt before. Remember your training, she told her pilots. Fear is just another sensation, like pain or cold or hunger. And you can function through all of those if you choose to on the Corvus assault carriers. Thousands of shock troops checked their weapons and armor one final time, their massive bodies filled with a fury that their ancestors would have recognized from the wars of conquest that had built their dominion. Long ago, High Chancellor Morvith stood among them, because a leader who asked his people to die should be willing to die alongside them. And he found himself grateful for the human training that had prepared him for this moment. For the Dominion, he roared. And his warriors roared back with a sound that shook the ship around them. The Void Heralds made first contact precisely as the Villani calculation engines had predicted, firing weapons that projected beams of absolute darkness that seemed to unravel the very fabric of space. The forward Concord vessels took the initial hits, and some of them died, their shields failing, and their hulls collapsing as crews screamed their final breaths into the void. But the fleet did not break. Admiral Chun watched her display as the human contingent executed their first maneuver, scattering from formation in patterns that looked like chaos but were actually precisely calculated responses to the enemy attack. The Heralds are adjusting their targeting, her tactical officer reported. They seem confused by our movement patterns. Good, Chun replied. Execute Phase 2. Throughout the nebula, hidden devices activated that the humans had spent weeks positioning. Gravitational generators that warped space itself into shapes that the Herald fleet was not prepared for. Enemy vessels suddenly found themselves caught in artificial gravity wells that disrupted their formation, pulling them off course and separating them from their support ships. Phase 2 is working, the tactical officer announced. Herald cohesion is breaking down. All squadrons engage, Chun ordered. And the real battle began. Yelthra led her pilots into the chaos with a scream of predatory joy, because this was what the Mercian had been born for. This dance of death among the stars that their peaceful centuries had denied them. Her fighters moved through the confused Herald formation like blades through flesh, striking at vulnerable points that human intelligence had identified during months of analysis. And enemy ships began to die. But the Heralds were not helpless. They adapted faster than anyone had expected, reconfiguring their formations to compensate for the gravity wells. And their counterattack claimed dozens of Mercian fighters in seconds. Yelthra watched her display as pilots she had known for years vanished in bursts of dark light. And she felt the fear trying to overwhelm her, trying to freeze her muscles and cloud her thoughts. Then she remembered what Lieutenant Colonel Becky had taught her. Fear is fuel, she whispered to herself. And she pushed her fighter harder into the enemy formation, drawing Herald attention away from her surviving pilots on the assault carriers. The Corvus shock troops launched toward the nearest disabled Herald vessel, their boarding pods designed by human engineers to penetrate any hull. Morvith was among the first wave, his massive body strapped into a pod that screamed through space toward the enemy ship. And when they breached the hull, he led his warriors into corridors that seemed to writhe with his organic darkness. The Heralds fought back with weapons that were part of their own bodies, blades and tendrils and sprays of corrosive fluid. And Corvus warriors died in numbers that would have broken any force that had not been prepared. But human trainers had shown them footage of the Herald interior, had prepared them for the horror of fighting an enemy that was as much nightmare as machine. And the shock troops pressed forward, For the Dominion, Morvith roared again as he crushed a herald warrior beneath his armored fist. For the Alliance, the battle raged for hours that felt like years, and the combined fleet suffered losses that would have seemed catastrophic in any previous conflict. But they did not retreat, and they did not surrender, Admiral. Chun watched her display with growing concern as the Herald fleet began to push back against their assault. Because the enemy was learning from every exchange, adapting to every tactic. We are losing momentum, her tactical officer warned. If this continues, the Herald formation will stabilize and we will be overwhelmed. Chun had known this moment would come. The moment when the first plan failed and everything depended on what came next. Signal the second fleet, she ordered. Execute contingency Omega, deep in the nebula, hidden by radiation and gravity distortions. A second human fleet powered up their engines and prepared to enter the battle. This force had been held in reserve, unknown even to most of the Alliance commanders, because humans had learned long ago that the greatest advantage in war was the ability to surprise. The second fleet emerged behind the Herald formation, catching them in a crossfire that the enemy had not anticipated. And suddenly, the momentum of the battle shifted, but the Heralds adapted again, splitting their forces to engage both threats. And Chun realized that even this would not be enough. We need to end this decisively, she said, more to herself than to her crew. If we let them escape, they will learn from this battle and return stronger. She made a decision that she had hoped to avoid. Signal the third fleet, she ordered. Full attack, all contingencies. Her tactical officer stared at her in shock, because even he had not known about a third fleet deep within the nebula, hidden in a region that every navigation computer insisted was impossible to traverse. The third human fleet activated their drives and began their approach. They used a navigation technique that the Concorde had declared suicidal centuries ago, threading through gravity storms and radiation pulses that should have destroyed any vessel. But human pilots had been practicing this route for months. When the third fleet emerged in the heart of the Herald formation, the enemy finally experienced something they had not felt in millennia: surprise. Followed by fear, the Herald command ship, a massive vessel that coordinated the entire fleet, suddenly found itself surrounded by human warships that had appeared from nowhere, and before it could respond, boarding parties were breaching its hull. Admiral Chun watched the tactical display as human Marines and Corvette shock troops fought their way toward the Herald Command Center, and she felt hope building in her chest. All vessels, she announced, press the attack. Give them no time to recover, no room to retreat, no hope of survival. The combined fleet surged forward with renewed fury, and the Battle of Threshold entered its final phase. The Herald command ship was dying around them, its organic walls pulsing with strange colors as its life force bled into the void. And Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Becky led her combined assault team deeper into its heart. Human Marines fought alongside Corvette shock troops, moving through corridors that seemed to shift and change with every step. And the Heralds threw everything they had at the invaders. But it was not enough. Becky had studied these creatures for years, had learned their patterns and predicted their responses. And she guided her team through the nightmare with the calm precision of someone who had prepared for this moment her entire career. Command Center is ahead, she announced through her helmet communicator. All units prepare for final breach. High Chancellor Morvith stood beside her, his armor scarred from a dozen wounds that would have killed a lesser being. And he felt a respect for this small human that surprised him. You fight well, he said as they approached the massive doors that separated them from their objective. For a species so young, Becky glanced at him with a thin smile. Youth has its advantages, Chancellor. We have not yet learned what is supposed to be impossible. The doors burst open under their combined assault, and they charged into a chamber that pulsed with the collective consciousness of the entire Herald fleet. a network of organic machinery that linked every enemy vessel in perfect coordination. At its center stood the Herald Prime, a creature that towered over even the massive Corvus. Its body a nightmare of blades and tendrils, and eyes that seemed to look into places beyond normal space. It spoke, and its voice resonated through the chamber in frequencies that made every warrior's bones vibrate. "You fight well," it said, echoing Morvath's words with what might have been mockery. "But you cannot destroy us, for we are eternal. We were feeding on civilizations before your stars were born, and we will continue long after your species are forgotten." Meki stepped forward, her weapon raised, and she felt no fear. Only a cold determination that had been forged through years of training and preparation. "Maybe," she replied. "But today, you learn what it means to fight something that does not surrender." The battle that followed would become legend among 100 species. A desperate struggle in the heart of an alien nightmare, and when it was over, the Herald Prime lay broken at their feet. But the true discovery came when they accessed the command center's data core. "There are coordinates here," Becky reported to Admiral Chun through her communicator. "Navigation data to the Herald homeworld, and there is something else. A message." She transmitted the message to the Thermopylae, where Chun read it with a strange expression on her weathered face. "We were made to feed," the message read. "We know no other way." The battle ended 3 hours later when the last Herald vessel was destroyed or captured, and the combined fleet gathered among the debris of their greatest victory. The cost had been enormous, with thousands of ships lost and millions of warriors dead. But the threat that had consumed civilizations for millennia was finally broken. Admiral Chun called a command council on the Thermopylae, and representatives from every species in the Alliance gathered to decide what came next. "We have their homeworld coordinates," she announced. "We could pursue them, finish what we started, ensure they never threaten the galaxy again." High Chancellor Morvath spoke first, his voice carrying the weight of his losses. "They destroyed worlds without mercy, harvested billions of sentient beings. They deserve extinction." Many voices rose in agreement, calling for vengeance, demanding that the Heralds pay for their crimes with the total destruction of their species. But Ambassador Kethrai noticed that the human admiral had not joined the calls for extermination. "Admiral Chun," she asked, "what is your recommendation?" Chun was silent for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was softer than Kethri had ever heard it. "The message we found said they were made to feed," she said, "that they know no other way. And I have been thinking about what that means." She turned to face the assembly. "Humanity has been the monster before," she continued. "Not exactly like the Heralds, but close enough. We have conquered and destroyed and consumed. We have committed atrocities that shame us to this day." The chamber was absolutely silent. "We learned to be better," Chun said, painfully, "over centuries, with many setbacks and failures. But we changed, we evolved. We found other ways to exist." She pulled up the star map showing the Herald homeworld. "I am not asking for forgiveness of their crimes, because what they have done is unforgivable. But I am suggesting that extinction is not the only option, that containment might be possible, that with time and pressure even monsters can change." Commander Yelfra spoke from her seat, her voice carrying a weariness that matched the Admiral's. "After everything we lost, you want to show them mercy." "Not mercy," Chum replied. "Patience. Because true victory is not just destroying your enemy. It is creating a future where they are no longer your enemy." The debate continued for days, with passionate arguments on both sides. But in the end, the Alliance voted to contain rather than destroy. Human ships would lead a permanent containment force around Herald space, watching and waiting, ready to respond if the threat emerged again, but also ready to offer guidance if the Heralds chose to change. Kethri approached Admiral Chun after the final vote. finding her alone on the observation deck, staring out at the stars. "I thought humans were warriors," the ambassador said quietly. "I expected you to lead the call for extermination." Chun smiled, and there was something ancient and tired in her expression. "We are warriors," she agreed. "But the best warriors know that fighting is not always the answer. That sometimes the harder battle is choosing peace when vengeance would be easier." She turned to face HFY. "The doctrine of paranoia is not just about preparing for war, Ambassador. It is about understanding that war is terrible and should be avoided whenever possible. We prepare because we must, not because we want to." A century passed, and the galaxy changed in ways no one had predicted. The Concord reformed itself with humanity at its heart, not as conquerors but as guardians, teaching the lessons they had learned through millennia of conflict, while hoping those lessons would never be needed. The containment force around Harold Space reported gradual changes. A slowing of expansion, a reduction in harvesting. Subtle signs that something was shifting in the enemy consciousness, and then, one day, a single Herald vessel approached the containment line, broadcasting a message of peace. The first Herald ambassador arrived at the Grand Assembly 112 years after the Battle of Threshold, and it was smaller than its ancestors, quieter, its form suggesting evolution rather than conquest. "We wish to learn," it said through translation systems that struggled with concepts the Heralds had never expressed before. "We wish to find another way." The process would take generations, with setbacks and failures and moments when it seemed the old hunger would return, but slowly, painfully. The Heralds began to change. HFY was very old when she visited Earth for the final time. Her crystalline form faded and dim, and she found Admiral Chun's memorial standing in a garden overlooking the sea. "You were right," she said to the stone marker. "Patience was the harder victory, but it was the better one on Earth." In bunkers beneath mountains and moons and asteroids, the weapons caches remained stocked and ready, because humans never forgot the lessons of their bloody history. Each generation hoped to be the one that never needed them. Each generation maintained them anyway, and the galaxy, which had once dismissed humanity as primitive warmongers, now understood the truth that the same species capable of terrible destruction was also capable of remarkable restraint, that the warriors who prepared for the worst were often the ones most committed to achieving the best. That peace was not the absence of weapons, but the wisdom to keep them sheathed. As the sun set over the memorial garden, a human child asked her grandfather about the ancient wars, and he told her the story of a galaxy that had prepared for invasion, and a species that had been waiting. "Were we the heroes?" the child asked. The grandfather smiled and took her hand. "We were ready," he said. "And when the time came, we chose to be merciful, because that is the hardest choice of all and the most human." The stars wheeled overhead, ancient and indifferent, and somewhere among them, former enemies were learning to become something new. The doctrine of paranoia endured, passed down through generations with the same quiet prayer. May we never need this. May we always have it. And may we be wise enough to know the difference between a war that must be fought and a peace that can be built. The end.